The plush carpet of the high-end law firm seemed to absorb the light, and the excessively cold air conditioning only heightened the sense of anxiety that lingered. This was not an ordinary divorce. It was the public end of a marriage between two business dynasties. The tension was almost palpable, heavy as the dark marble that lined the walls. On one side of Arthur's imposing desk sat Arthur Montgomery, the billionaire heir of Montgomery Global Logistics. He was relaxed, overly confident, almost mocking. His blue eyes, usually alert and cold as ice, were fixed on the door. Beside him, occupying the chair that should have been his, was Lily, a young platinum blonde wearing a red silk dress, which was, for all intents and purposes, a provocative and calculated gesture from Arthur. He had brought her as a trophy, a clear demonstration that he had moved on, and that his marriage to his ex-wife Helen was now just a forgotten footnote. Arthur had orchestrated the scene meticulously. He wanted Helen to feel the weight of his rejection, to understand that while he was thriving and in love, she was being discarded. He had filed for divorce almost a year ago, claiming that his love for Lily was overwhelming and that he could no longer live a farce. What Arthur didn't know was that the divorce request had hit Helen at the exact moment she was about to reveal the news that would change both their lives. She was pregnant. The door opened. Arthur straightened in his chair, a rehearsed smile of superiority and indifference on his lips, ready to unleash the indifference he had planned. But the smile froze. Helen entered the room, and the effect was immediate and devastating to his confidence. She was neither disheveled nor desperate. She wore a simple yet impeccable dress in a forest green that accentuated the natural elegance of her posture. Her dark brown hair was loose, falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She exuded a mature serenity that Arthur had never seen in her, almost an aura of peace that brutally contrasted with the emotional chaos he expected to inflict. But it was not Helen's demeanor that paralyzed him. It was what she carried. Nestled in her arms, wrapped in a soft white cashmere shawl, was a small bundle, a bundle that breathed, that moved slightly, a bundle he immediately recognized, with a terror that sent a chill down his spine like a newborn baby. Arthur's eyes widened. His lawyers, who had been flipping through files, stopped. Lily beside him lost her air of superiority, and her jaw nearly dropped. The silence in the room became a deafening void. Helen walked calmly, sat in the chair across from Arthur, next to her own lawyers, and adjusted the baby carefully. "Sorry for the delay." Helen's voice was calm, professional, devoid of any trace of emotion. She looked directly at Arthur. Her hazel eyes were like impenetrable shields. "I had to make sure. Daisy had been fed. She's only a month old. And since the divorce took so long to finalize, it was inevitable that she would be here today." Daisy. The name resonated in Arthur's mind like an alarm bell. A month. Everything fell into place in a brutal second. The divorce request had occurred 10 months ago. A 1-month-old baby meant she got pregnant before, or at most just after he filed. They were still married at the time of conception. The shock was so intense that Arthur had to grip the table. He had spent the last year reveling in his freedom, flaunting Lily, and believing that Helen was at home lamenting. He had discarded her without a second thought, declaring his love for another. And now, here was the living proof that he had lost more than just a marriage. He had lost the chance to witness a pregnancy and the birth of a child. Anger bubbled in Lily, who couldn't contain the whispered comment, loud enough to be heard. "Who is the father of this child, Helen?" Helen slowly turned her head toward her ex-husband's lover. It was the first time she showed anything beyond indifference, a look of coldness so sharp it made Lily shrink back. "Paternity of Daisy is not in question in this divorce, Lily," Helen replied, her voice maintaining composure but with a sharp edge. "She is my daughter. And if your concern is about Arthur's assets, You can be assured that I have my own inheritance from my family, and I am not after his money. The only thing I care about is closing this chapter as quickly as possible and securing my daughter's future." The use of the term "my daughter" and the emphasis on the fact that she didn't need his money struck Arthur where it hurt the most, his pride. The financial indifference was a punch. The fact that she had a child and hadn't told him was an even greater blow. Arthur finally managed to speak, his voice hoarse. "Helen, we need to talk privately. What is this? Why didn't you tell me?" Helen sighed, a gesture of genuine weariness. "Arthur, there's nothing to discuss. When you filed for divorce saying you loved another and that our life together was a mistake, any meaningful communication between us was over. I was about to tell you about the pregnancy, but your declaration of love for your new partner made it clear that you would have no interest in a child with me. And I didn't want my child to be born into an environment where the father would consider her a burden or an obligation." She looked at the small, sleeping face of Daisy, a deep, protective love illuminating her eyes. That was the only moment in... As she relaxed, it was the only chink in the armor she had built. Helen's lawyer intervened with a firm voice. "Gentlemen, I ask that we return to the matter of asset division and agreements. My client wishes to resolve this quickly and quietly. The prenuptial assets are clearly defined, and Mrs. Helen is waiving any claim to the shares of Montgomery Global Logistics. We only want the immediate release of the divorce decree." Arthur was too dazed to focus on financial details. He looked at the baby, trying to find any resemblance to himself, or worse, to any other man that Helen might have met in the meantime. But Daisy was very small, only a month old, a tiny bundle of innocence that had dismantled all his plans of superiority. "Helen, we need a DNA test," Arthur demanded, his voice full of authority usually used in board meetings, but now sounding desperate. The smile that appeared on Helen's face was a mix of scorn and deep sadness. "You lost that right, Arthur," she replied calmly. "You abdicated your responsibility and interest when you chose another woman and told me you no longer loved me. Daisy doesn't need a father who claims her just out of wounded pride or to avoid public embarrassment. She has me, and that is enough." The meeting continued, but for Arthur it was just background noise. His mind was in turmoil. He watched Helen, the way she held the baby, the maternal instinct he had never seen, as they had postponed motherhood to focus on their careers. That little being had transformed Helen into a woman he barely recognized. Strong, independent, and what was more humiliating, completely uninterested in him. Lily, the mistress, had become irrelevant in the room, a forgotten footnote, just as Arthur had tried to make Helen. The stage now belonged to mother and daughter. At the end of the long and tense meeting, while the lawyers reviewed the final papers, Helen stood up. She did not look at Arthur. She simply adjusted Daisy and headed for the door. Arthur couldn't take it. He stood up, slightly staggering, and approached her. "Helen, I didn't know. Let me see my daughter." Helen stopped and looked at him. The judgment in her eyes was more painful than any accusation. "She is not yours. You never wanted children with me. You wanted Lily. She is Daisy, my daughter." She left the office without looking back, leaving Arthur standing in the middle of the room, the brutal realization of his loss crushing him. He had traded a family for a fleeting affair, and for the first time in his pampered life, he tasted the bitter flavor of true regret. Meanwhile, outside the large building, the scene was being observed by a pair of very different eyes. In a coffee shop across the street was Victor Anderson, a tech entrepreneur, also with considerable wealth, but with a more discreet and practical approach to life. He was there for a business meeting with a client who had just cancelled. Victor was taking the moment to read a report and have a coffee when he saw the commotion outside Arthur Montgomery's office. A familiar face from the business circuit with whom he maintained a cold and distant professional relationship. He saw an elegant woman hurriedly exiting with a baby in her arms. Something in her posture caught his attention. There was dignity in her stride, but also a silent vulnerability. She paused for a moment, the cold autumn wind blowing, and she pulled her shawl to protect the baby. Victor, with his attentive nature and instinct for chivalry, noticed that she seemed about to call a taxi, which, with a newborn, seemed incredibly inconvenient. He saw her face when she turned to the street and was instantly struck, not just by her classic beauty, but by the expression in her eyes that he interpreted as a mix of relief at having escaped and a deep sadness that surrounded her like a fog. Helen finally managed to signal a taxi that stopped abruptly. As she awkwardly tried to open the back door with the baby in her lap, the strap of her bag slipped and fell to the ground, spilling its contents, wallet, keys, lipstick, onto the pavement. Victor dropped the report. Chivalry overcame discretion. He couldn't bear to see her struggle. He crossed the busy street, driven by an impulse that was completely atypical in his orderly life. "Please, let me help," he said, his voice deep and calm. He quickly knelt down, gathering the scattered items before he could even think of a proper excuse to intrude. Helen looked up, surprised by the sudden interruption. Her eyes met his, green, deep, and filled with a genuine kindness that was rare in her world. Victor was not looking at her with lust or judgment, only with practical concern. "Oh, thank you so much," she said, a bit breathless. "I'm so clumsy with Daisy." Victor gathered everything, handed her the bag, and held it while she slung it over her shoulder. He then opened the taxi door wide and made a slight bow. "It's a pleasure. Mothers with newborns are, in fact, heroes." He smiled, a warm and open smile that relaxed the tension in Helen for the first time that day. "Just tired," she admitted, a small smile appearing on her lips. She got into the taxi, adjusted Daisy, and just as the door was about to close, she felt she needed to know who that kind man was. "I'm Helen," she said, extending her hand out of the taxi. Victor shook it firmly and warmly, his fingers large and strong. "Victor, it's a pleasure, Helen. I hope the rest of your day is much calmer." The taxi drove off, leaving. Victor stood alone on the sidewalk. He didn't return to the coffee shop immediately. He lingered there, watching the car drive away, feeling a strange sensation that this brief encounter, this act of kindness, had been more significant than it seemed. He knew that Helen had just come from an emotionally exhausting event. The law firm was proof of that. He saw the relief on her face as she left and the vulnerability she tried to hide. He took out his phone and sent a quick text to his assistant. "Find out the whereabouts of Helen Montgomery, Arthur's ex-wife, just for research purposes, if possible, discreetly." Victor wasn't a stalker, but he was a man of action and keen observation. Something about Helen's dignity, the way she protected the newborn baby, and the sadness he perceived in her eyes, made him feel that she deserved more than whatever she was facing. That glimpse of the mother and the baby had struck a chord in his heart that he didn't even know existed. He felt he needed to ensure she was okay. Even from a distance, he knew he was treading on dangerous ground. But the image of Helen's tired face and the small sleeping baby wouldn't leave his mind. He returned to his table, but his concentration had vanished. The business report faded into the background. He found himself imagining her life, the journey she was about to embark on as a single mother, and the strength that would be required to face the world of business and high society after such a public divorce. He was drawn to a woman he had only seen for 5 minutes, yet who seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. The silence of Helen's apartment was a luxury she had earned through years of hard work, but it was now filled with the soft melody of her baby. She was in the living room rocking Daisy, who had finally fallen into a deep sleep after a long and comforting feeding. The apartment, far from the cold opulence of Arthur's mansion, was her refuge, decorated in warm colors and filled with books and art, a reflection of her true self that she had suppressed during years of marriage to a man who valued ostentation over soul. The divorce had been finalized. The signature on the paper was one weight off her shoulders, but the emotional exhaustion still hit her in waves. The scene with Arthur and Lily, though painful in its predictability, had served as a final confirmation. She had made the right choice by moving on alone. Arthur was not the man she had loved, and he certainly would not be the father that Daisy deserved. However, his demand for a paternity test worried her. She knew with absolute certainty that Daisy was Arthur's daughter. The conception had occurred on the only and last night they had tried to fix the marriage before he publicly rejected her for Lily. She had planned to tell him, but the cruelty of his divorce request made her hesitate. Protecting Daisy from paternal rejection became her top priority. She gently placed Daisy in the crib and went to the kitchen to prepare some herbal tea. It was then that her phone rang. It was a message from her lawyer. Helen, Arthur is formally requesting a paternity test. He is threatening to go public if you do not cooperate. He claims that you are hiding the fact to deprive him of his parental rights. Helen felt bile rise in her throat. Arthur was using the media, his favorite weapon, to manipulate her. He wasn't interested in Daisy. He was interested in power and saving the public image of the family man he had tarnished. And, of course, he couldn't bear the thought that she might have moved on with another man so quickly. She typed her response to the lawyer with trembling hands. Tell him I will take the test, but on my terms. I want everything formalized. He must publicly acknowledge the baby if the result is positive. And I demand full custody. Visits will be supervised until Daisy is older and he proves to be a suitable father. Otherwise, he will have to prove paternity in court, and that will be long and painful for him. As she waited for a response, a pleasant memory interrupted her thoughts. The face of Victor, the kind man from the sidewalk, the way he knelt without hesitation to pick up her belongings, the firm and comforting touch of his hands. He was the antithesis of Arthur, discreet, attentive, and with an aura of calm. The brief encounter had been an unexpected balm on a horrible day. On the other side of the city, Victor couldn't concentrate. His office on the 3rd floor, with a panoramic view of the metropolis, was usually his productivity center. But today, the image of Helen and Daisy overshadowed all the graphs and reports. His assistant had sent him the summary he had requested. Helen Montgomery, former marketing executive, daughter of a traditional banking family, married to Arthur Montgomery. The divorce, although finalized, was the hottest gossip in the circuit. Victor discovered that Helen was a woman of remarkable intelligence and impeccable reputation who had stepped away from the spotlight to dedicate herself to her marriage, only to be publicly betrayed. Victor felt a wave of protective indignation. It was a new and powerful feeling. He finally decided to take action. He wouldn't invite her to a formal dinner. Helen didn't need another empty social engagement. She needed peace and perhaps a genuine conversation. He took out his lawyer's business card, which coincidentally was the same as Helen's, and called asking for her personal contact, claiming a business matter that might be of interest to her. Hours later, Helen received a discreet message on her phone, a text message from an unknown number. Victor Anderson, I hope you don't consider this an invasion. I know you just had a long day and probably aren't looking for company, but if you need a shoulder to lean on that isn't a lawyer, or just a coffee in a quiet place where no one will ask questions, please feel free to call me. No pressure. I just thought it might be nice to have a friendly face. Around. Helen read the message several times. It wasn't an invitation for a date, it was an invitation for comfort. There was no rush or flirting, obviously, just an offer of refuge. She smiled. It was exactly what she needed. She replied with a simple, "I would like a coffee, but my company comes with a bonus that requires silence. Do you mind the presence of Daisy?" The response was immediate. "I love babies. I know a coffee shop with a library that has big sofas and is famous for being quiet. Tomorrow at 10, the meeting the next day, felt strangely natural. The literary cafe was calm, and they sat in a secluded corner on a comfortable sofa where Daisy could sleep in her stroller. Victor didn't touch on the subject of Arthur's divorce or paternity. He talked about his work, creating clean tech startups, about books, travel, and his own family life, mentioning the loss of his mother when he was young, which had made him an introspective man who valued real connections. Helen, in turn, felt comfortable being herself. She spoke about her ambitions before Arthur, the joy of holding Daisy, and the simple pleasure of being a mother. She discovered that Victor had a subtle and insightful sense of humor, and that his green eyes not only watched her, but truly saw her. "You have incredible strength, Helen," Victor said at one point, taking a sip of his coffee. "Coming out of such a big marriage with a newborn and maintaining dignity, that's rare." Helen sighed. "It's not strength, Victor. It's survival instinct. After Arthur asked me for a divorce and said he loved someone else, I felt annihilated. But when I found out I was pregnant, I realized I wasn't fighting for myself anymore. Was fighting for her, and for her, I am invincible." Victor leaned forward. "The father, he knows." Helen hesitated. "He knows now, and he's making things difficult, demanding a paternity test. And what will you do?" "Yes, because I have nothing to hide. Daisy is his, but he lost the right to be the father she needs, and I will fight to ensure he is just a name on a document, not a toxic presence in her life." Helen's emotion was palpable, but her resolve was unshakable. Victor took her hand that was resting on the table, a gesture of silent and non-romantic comfort. "Whatever the outcome, Helen, remember, Daisy has you, and you are her world. A father who needs to be forced to acknowledge his own daughter is not worthy of you." His touch was warm, firm, and honest. There was no superficial sensuality like Arthur's, but rather a promise of safety. Helen felt herself blush and gently withdrew her hand, but with gratitude. They spent the afternoon talking, and by the end, Victor offered to drive them home. In the car, a luxurious black sedan, but without the ostentation of Arthur's cars, Victor drove calmly. He stopped, in front of her apartment. "I would like to see you again, Helen," he said, turning to look at her, not as a distraction, but as a friend who wants to help. "You are in a transitional phase, and I know how lonely that can be." "I would like that too, Victor," she admitted, feeling lighter than she had in months. "Thank you for today. You gave me a little piece of peace." As Helen and Victor's relationship blossomed into a deep friendship that subtly moved toward something more, Arthur's obsession grew. The fact that Helen was at peace, and, worse, dating another man, infuriated him. Arthur had reluctantly agreed to Helen's conditions for the paternity test, and the procedure was carried out discreetly at a private clinic. He could hardly wait to prove that the child was his, not out of paternal love, but to turn the tables and prove that Helen was a manipulator trying to deprive him. He believed that once paternity was proven, he could ruin Helen's new romance, and perhaps even win her back, feeling entitled to the family he had thrown away. A week later, Arthur's lawyer called. The voice was strangely tense. "Arthur, the results are in. The test is positive. She is your daughter." Relief and satisfaction filled Arthur. He laughed, a dry and triumphant sound. "I knew it. Tell Helen I want to see her immediately, and tell her that now I have rights." The lawyer coughed. "Arthur, there's a complication. Remember, the agreement you signed grants Helen full custody. You agreed to supervised visitation, and that will only be reversed if Helen allows it, or if you prove in court that she is unfit. Moreover, she has one final demand." "What?" Arthur asked, his voice growing impatient. "She wants you to make a public statement. She wants you to admit paternity of Daisy and apologize for leaving her alone during the pregnancy. She wants the media to know that you are the father, but also that you were the absent husband. It's a condition for her to even consider supervised visitation." Arthur went pale. Helen was publicly humiliating him. He, the powerful Arthur Montgomery, apologizing to his ex-wife. But he wanted the child. He wanted Daisy. He wanted control. And he knew that if he tried to fight in court, Helen would destroy him with the story of betrayal and abandonment. "Tell her I will," Arthur grunted, swallowing his bitter pride. "But tell her this will not be the last word. I will have that child." As Arthur plotted his revenge and the rescue of his image, Helen and Victor were in a park under a tree, watching Daisy sleep. Victor was reading a passage from a poetry book to Helen, his voice low and melodic. "Are you tense, Helen?" Victor observed, closing the book. Helen smiled, but it was a forced smile. "Arthur accepted the test and agreed to my conditions. He will make a public statement." "That's good," Victor said. "It's good and terrifying. I forced him to be public about paternity so he wouldn't use it against me, but I know he won't give up. He sees Daisy as a trophy, a way to hurt me, not as a daughter." Victor took her hand again, this time without hesitation. He didn't let go. "Helen, I told you that you are invincible because of her, and I am here by your side. Let Arthur have his spotlight. You have reality. You have Daisy, and I want to be part of that reality, if you allow me." He looked deeply into her eyes. The friendship had reached its peak. The time for caution was over. "I don't just want to be a friend, Helen. I'm a practical man. I know you have a child and an obsessive ex-husband, but I also know that I have never felt for anyone what I feel for you, this dignity, this strength in your heart. I love the way you protect Daisy. I love that you prioritize her. I want to support you, and I want to love you and Daisy as if she were mine, even if her biological father is a jerk." Helen felt tears welling up in her eyes. They were not tears of sadness, but of acceptance of a happiness she didn't know she deserved. "Victor, I don't need to answer you now," he gently interrupted. "Just know this. I love you, Helen, and I will prove that I am the man you and your daughter deserve." Arthur Montgomery's statement to the press was a carefully orchestrated media event, but disastrous in its essence, with airs of false contrition. He confirmed paternity of Daisy and promised to take responsibility, but the note was clearly aimed at saving his image as a respectable businessman and not at expressing paternal affection. However, the act of publicly acknowledging Daisy was Helen's victory. She had forced his hand, ensuring the world knew he was the father, but that she was the only guardian of the child. With that public chapter closed, Helen allowed herself to focus on the only thing that truly mattered, her happiness and Daisy's. And that happiness had the name and face of Victor Anderson. Their relationship blossomed quickly, based on mutual respect and an emotional intimacy that Helen had never known was possible. Victor was not just a lover, he was a safe harbor. He adapted to the routine of a baby naturally, learning to change diapers, sterilize bottles, and rock Daisy with a patience and tenderness that melted Helen's heart. He spent nights with them, not just as a guest, but as an active participant in the family life they were building. Their romance was intense and genuine. The physical connection that followed the emotional bond was explosive. Helen, who had felt neglected and invisible in her marriage to Arthur, found in Victor a man who idolized her. He saw her as a complete woman, mother, professional, and lover. His touches were slow, deliberate, full of tenderness and burning desire. They explored passion at a pace that respected her exhaustion as a mother, transforming stolen moments into precious displays of love and total devotion. On a rainy night, while Daisy slept soundly, they were together on the couch under a soft blanket. Victor kissed her with a devotion that took her breath away. "You are the most beautiful and strong woman I have ever met, Helen," he whispered, caressing her skin with a reverence that made her feel desired in a pure and profound way. "With you, I don't just want to build a life. I want to build a legacy, a family." Helen nestled into his neck, inhaling the familiar scent of sandalwood and warm skin. "I feel the same, Victor. I never thought it would be possible to find this. Don't you fear everything that comes with me? With Daisy? With Arthur?" Victor lifted her face so she would look at him. His green eyes were serious and full of conviction. "Daisy is not a burden, Helen. She is a miracle, and I love her as if she were mine from the moment I saw her in your arms. As for Arthur, he is just a shadow of your past. He may be a billionaire, but what does he have that I don't? Your love, your trust. I give you peace, Helen. I give you a future. He can only offer you chaos and regret." In that moment, they sealed their fate. Victor, kneeling beside the couch, pulled out a velvet box. It was not a flashy diamond like the ones Arthur had given her, but a dark blue sapphire ring surrounded by diamonds, elegant and timeless, reflecting her beauty and depth. "Marry me, Helen. Let me take care of you and Daisy forever." Helen didn't hesitate. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "Yes, Victor. Yes. 1,000 times yes." As Helen and Victor lived the euphoria of their discreet engagement, Arthur Montgomery seethed with rage and jealousy. His sources in the social circuit. Arthur was quickly informed about Helen's serious involvement with Victor Anderson, one of his main competitors in the technology sector, even though they operated in different niches. The fact that Victor was so wealthy and successful genuinely irritated him. It felt like a personal insult. He had finally scheduled his first supervised visitation with Daisy, months after the divorce and the paternity test conducted at Helen's home under the watchful eye of a social worker. The meeting was a disaster. Arthur, used to commanding boardrooms, felt lost with a baby in his arms. He tried to bribe Daisy with expensive toys and attempted to converse with her as if she were an adult, ignoring the subtleties of child interaction. Daisy, sensing the lack of genuine connection, began to cry. Helen entered the room, calming Daisy in seconds with her familiar touch and picking her up. Arthur watched in frustration. "You're doing this on purpose, Helen," he accused, his voice low and venomous. "You're trying to keep me away from my own daughter. You're distancing Daisy from you, Arthur." Helen retorted calmly. "She is just a few months old and needs love and routine, not a father who barely knows her favorite toy's name. You're here out of obligation, not desire, and she feels that." "I'm here because I'm her father," he growled, his face tense. "And who is this Victor Anderson? Have you already introduced him to play daddy with my daughter? You're exposing her to a stranger?" Helen stared at him coldly, the sapphire ring hidden in the palm of her hand. "Daisy has been exposed to the only thing she needs, a loving home. And if you want to talk about her life, I suggest you stop sending detectives to follow the man I'm engaged to. My engagement to Victor will be public soon, and he will be the man Daisy recognizes as her father in every way that matters." Arthur staggered back, the news hitting him like an electric shock. He had lost everything. He had lost Helen, his life, and now he was about to lose his connection with his daughter to a rival who loved her unconditionally. "You can't do this, Helen. I will fight for this child in court. I am the biological father, Arthur shouted desperately. Can you fight, Arthur? Helen said, her voice firm and resolute. But remember, the court doesn't care only about DNA. It cares about the child's best interest. And the best interest for Daisy is the man who holds her when she cries, who cares about her vaccinations, and who doesn't treat her like a power game. Victor is that man, and you lost your chance. The social worker intervened, ending the visit prematurely. Arthur left the home trembling with rage, but Helen's words echoed in his mind. He had lost his chance. He had traded true love for instant gratification, and now he was paying the price. Helen closed the door and sighed, returning to the arms of Victor, who was waiting for her in the kitchen. She was no longer afraid of Arthur. She had a love that shielded her. The news of Helen Bastos's engagement to Victor Anderson, the discreet tech mogul, stirred social circles more than any divorce scandal. The contrast between Arthur Montgomery's public coldness and Victor's evident dedication to Helen and Daisy was undeniable. The media quickly turned against Arthur, painting him as the negligent ex-husband who had traded happiness for an affair and was now desperately trying to reclaim what he had thrown away. In his arrogance, Arthur attempted to use his financial power to destabilize Victor, launching a campaign of subtle attacks in the business press and trying to undermine some of his projects. But Victor was more than a competitor. He was a shrewd strategist and, above all, a man of unwavering principles. He faced Arthur's attacks with dignity and transparency, turning the dispute into yet another public defeat for Helen's ex-husband. Arthur's last resort was to file a lawsuit, demanding more custody time and arguing that the stable environment of his wealth would be superior for Daisy. He sought joint custody, seeing this as the only way to maintain some control over Helen's life. The trial was the climax of months of tension. The judge, after hearing testimonies and analyzing the evidence, did not focus solely on finances or DNA. He focused on the child's well-being. Helen and Victor testified, describing Daisy's routine, how Victor had fully integrated into her life and the emotional stability he provided. Victor, in an emotional testimony, declared his unconditional love for Daisy, expressing his desire to adopt her legally. Arthur's lawyer presented asset charts and the paternity test evidence, but Arthur's testimony was his ruin. He spoke about his rights, the shame of being excluded, and how he could offer Daisy a more luxurious future. He failed to mention her name, her feeding times, or any intimate details of her life. He failed to demonstrate love. The judge delivered the verdict with brutal clarity. The court recognizes Mr. Arthur Montgomery's biological paternity. However, the court also recognizes that the biological father has demonstrated a lack of interest and significant involvement in Daisy's life from conception to the present moment. The best interest of the child is not the father's wealth, but rather the stability and affection of the mother. Mrs. Helen Bastos has demonstrated that she has built a loving home, supported by Mr. Victor Anderson, who has proven to be a committed and constant father figure. Full custody of Daisy is granted to Helen, with Victor obtaining permission to initiate the process of adoption. Arthur was limited to quarterly supervised visits at the discretion of the social worker and Helen. It was the end. Arthur had lost the battle and, more importantly, had lost the chance to be a father, replaced by the man Helen had chosen. 2 years later, Helen and Victor's home was a refuge of laughter and love. They had married in an intimate and elegant ceremony, and Victor had completed the adoption of Daisy, who was now Daisy Anderson. Arthur's name was just a distant note, a faded echo. Daisy, a clever 2-year-old girl, called Victor Daddy, with the sweetness and conviction of a child who recognizes the truth of the heart. Victor, in turn, was the most devoted father one could imagine, reading bedtime stories, attending school meetings, and being the pillar of a complete family. Helen thrived. Free from Arthur's shadow, she reignited her career with Victor's unwavering support, and together they formed a couple that was the epitome of success and true love. They had built an empire of happiness based on values, not vanity. On a sunny afternoon, Helen watched Victor play with Daisy in the garden. He tossed her into the air, and the laughter of the two people she loved most filled the air. Victor looked at Helen, and she saw in his green eyes the same promise of security and devotion from the day he helped her gather her bag on the sidewalk. He was the new love she deserved. He was the father Daisy needed. They were a family. And that love that began amidst a painful divorce and a newborn baby was proof that destiny sometimes waits for the right moment to bring the right person. This is the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed Helen and Victor's journey. If you are not subscribed, consider subscribing for more stories like this.